Hello and welcome to AWS Made Easy. Now, this is the show where we talk to people from AWS. We cover the latest in cost optimization, FinOps, and of course AI, and try to do our best to just give you the latest on AWS in general. My name's Stephen Barr.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rahul Subramaniam. I'm really excited to getting back on air. It's been a little while, but we've been kind of heads down trying to keep up with all the amazing stuff that's been going on, not just within AWS, but also outside. And a ton of things are influencing each other right now. Uh, of course, also with the trade wars and all the other drama going around the world, it is a very, very exciting time.
That's for sure. It's so much has been happening, but with at least in the tech side, yeah, I'm glad I'm not an economist or a foreign currency trader right now. I'm very happy to be on the tech side of things, and that's been great. That's been fantastic. There's been a lot of innovation. I think you'd be under a digital rock if you hadn't heard of MCP by now. That
Very true.
MCP has been a real. It's one of those things. I liken it to Dropbox. Like when Dropbox first came out, everyone's like, okay, this doesn't really solve an unsolved problem in the sense
Hmm.
that you could share files before, but it made it easier than ever to do it. And I think MCP is like Dropbox of AI server interaction. Rahul, do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think this is number one. This is, I think, a great topic to pick up because MCP is literally being used as a buzzword everywhere. You ask every second person about MCP, and they're like, "Oh, everyone thinks that we should just take this and make it MCP because somehow it's going to add value." But I don't think a lot of people really understand, you know, where MCP should be used, why it should be used, where it fits in. And if I were to summarize, it basically helps LLMs uh, talk to other external services to add more context to whatever they are doing. And that's fundamentally what it does in its simplest, rawest form. And then you can leverage that to do some other exciting stuff that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Because LLMs are trained primarily on whatever data they've been trained on in the past. They don't have access to your data, they don't have access to your stuff, which is very valuable information. Now, historically, we've taken that, we've added that to context as part of some prompt and things like that, but there should be easier mechanisms of doing it. And MCP is kind of the evolution of what that mechanism is.
Yeah. So MCP, for context, the Model Context Protocol, initially developed by Anthropic, and it's a way of having your chats call tools. Now that wasn't the first way of doing that, right? So OpenAI
Correct.
had tool calling,
That's
and you
true.
could give you can give chat your you can give your OpenAI or Chat GPT a open API specification, and you can start calling endpoints. And this was great.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
then with Amazon Bedrock, you have Bedrock agents who can also call Lambda functions. So, what's the big differentiator for MCP?
Yeah. I think what MCP did was it actually made things a lot easier to specify the tool endpoints. It commoditized, I would say, the tool calling process by making it standard and by making it, adaptable everywhere. So tool calling, of course, was very innovative, made it really simple to call external services, but to commoditize it and make it a very standard way of doing it, where you don't burden yourself with creating these huge JSON files that describe the entire Open API specification. And some of them are very cumbersome to do, like building those by hand. There weren't tools out there to do it. Building out Open API spec equivalents of JSON files that you kind of massage and caress and make sure that they are just right for tool calling. That was cumbersome. And then trying to figure out, you know, other capabilities, like there were certain things that you needed, for example, resources and stuff like that, which just weren't defined. There wasn't any protocol around it in the past. You would define your objects in JSON format in the past, and they were just random. There wasn't any structure to it. I think MCP basically simplifies a lot of that process and just makes it all seamless, where we move up one abstraction level, and it makes life easier for developers or folks just using LLMs to do things.
Yeah. I remember we did our ClickUp demonstration a
Yep.
while ago. And in order to do that, so I had my SBCT, the Stephen Bar Centaur tool. And how that worked was a whole bunch of Python functions where every single Python function had a pydantic input and output type. And then I had to package this all up and then basically hand it to, in this case, Bedrock via the Converse API. As here's this data structure representing a bunch of tools and their input types, their output types. And it was very bespoke to my setup. There was no discoverability. I had to put the whole thing together by hand.
Correct.
And so, on the one hand, it was very fine-grained, which was nice, but integrating another API would have been a project. Whereas now with MCP, the great thing is the discoverability component, where every MCP server can list the tools that it exposes.
Correct. And as if I recall that episode that we did where we were doing this ClickUp integration and using LLMs with it, I don't think a non-developer could have possibly implemented that solution. It's just not possible. There's just too many technical details involved in making it all work. But with MCP, now you literally can have anyone, even a non-developer, be able to very quickly look up an MCP server that's available, use any of the clients that are now available, whether it be Cloud Desktop or your Cursor or C-Line or Client, however you call it, or any of the other, clients or chat clients that you use LLMs with. You can immediately hook up an MCP server with those and get started. So it makes life really simple. It democratizes tool calling to a much, much larger audience and makes it really simple to execute.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it so much easier. You see a little blob of JSON, you copy and paste. Maybe you have to install something off of NPM. Usually it's just some npx whatever or a Docker file, and you paste something into your client's config JSON. They all take basically the same format, and you are off to the races talking to some other server. Might have to deal with authentication, which we'll talk about in a second. So what I wanted to do for the rest of this show, wanted to talk about what AWS is doing with MCP. I wanted to get thoughts on your experience. What tools do you use? What are some of your favorite MCP servers? How does your workflow look like? How we are using MCP personally. I think sometimes you can see lots of different LinkedIn posts about it, but actually seeing it in action, that can be worth 1,000 posts. We also want to help you sort through I think there's a huge amount of hype, which is probably justified, but there's also, with every hype cycle, you get the skeptics saying this is going to be awful. This is opening up huge security holes. This is not as good as everyone is saying. How do we take this middle road? Or are the skeptics right? Or should we just go 100% into the hype cycle? How do we sort this out? So let's think about that. Then we want to talk about a project that you were involved with, MCP Hive, and how it possibly solves some of these challenges. So let's do that. Let me pull up the first one. There's an Amazon announcement on MCP servers for code assistance. Let's have a look at what this one is. This is a suite of MCP servers that bring AWS best practices directly into your development workflow. So this is MCP servers where you can ask, reduce your development time while incorporating security controls, cost optimizations, and AWS well-architected best practices into your code.
Yeah.
So the idea is you have these MCP servers, and you can say, how do I implement this particular thing, or give me the documentation for this service, and it knows where to get it. And it can be like a specialized knowledge provider.
Correct. Now, this is actually a really good context to talk about something that I meant to discuss some time ago, but I think this is a great anchor for it. Now, all of us have used an IDE at some time or the other, right? And we are so familiar with, opening up Visual Studio Code and then looking at, your code, and then suddenly there's things that are underlined or there are problems or there are details that need to be fixed that show up in your console almost immediately as soon as the file is open. Now, MCP has been very significantly influenced by something called the language server protocol that has existed in IDEs for a really long time. And the idea that you wanted a similar setup with LLMs, where LLMs could then immediately query and do amazing stuff with code, that I think was quite a big ask. So the MCP protocol kind of tries to do something similar and bring some of those capabilities of the of these different tools into the LLM space. So if you're familiar with language server protocol, you've used all the extensions in Visual Studio Code. Think of the MCP as a similar mechanism to bring in all these other tools that are available or extensions that are available to the LLM right where you need it. Now, code, of course, is the very first thing you think about when you think about extensions required to actually do something useful. So LLMs require all kinds of different tools that can act in different ways on the code, and that context is incredibly valuable to the LLM because it is your code. The LLM is not trained on your code, historically. So to be able to do all of that stuff is really valuable, and that's why having all these other capabilities like the context about well-architected framework and how to apply it and all of that, making it available to your coding tools that are LLM driven is incredibly valuable.
What this reminds me of, this might be a silly comparison, and if this will really go down a bit of a nerdy path here, but did you ever get into, like, I think the Ubuntu of maybe 12 years ago, when you'd mix and match window managers and composters and compositors, and you'd really your setup was so personal to yourself.
Yep.
And then what ends up happening to most of us, you get older, you get busier, you buy a Mac, and you've got the one true way of doing things.
True.
But now, and you miss that whole mix and match customization that you used to have. And now with MCP development and all the explosion of different tools, I feel like we're back in that way. We're grabbing an MCP server here. This IDE does this. You can use this extension from inside this IDE or by itself. Use it with your own model of choice. And there's a lot of exploration and kind of hyper personalization of people's workflows again.
Yeah, I do believe that there's a lot of personalization of the workflows that's happening now, because as the capabilities of these AIs are increasing, as the context windows are increasing, you're now suddenly finding a ton of use cases where if you had more context, you could probably be more productive. You could do a lot more. And so it boils down to where and when are you going to draw more context into your LLMs so that you can actually get them to do something useful. A lot of early LLM usage, I mean, I'm talking about, when I say early, I mean up to 6 months ago. This space changes so rapidly that it's crazy. But most people just used it in a text-based mode. There were a few developers who used it to generate a little bit of code, but for the vast majority, it was searching for something, using tools like Perplexity, which had LLMs driving it, or just, researching stuff on the net, or researching, for content, or even just rehashing and reshaping your thoughts and your processes into something that's more universally acceptable, kind of massaging content one way or the other. Those are the primary use cases. But now when you start looking at things like the thinking capabilities of LLMs, when you suddenly see that, you're like, oh, I want the LLM to look at all of this data that is very personal. Only I have this data, but I wanted to think through, debate about it. I wanted to critique it. I wanted to refine it. When you want to do things like that with all the data that's sitting with you, then you're suddenly thinking about, okay, how do I make all this data accessible to the LLM so that it can go think about it, it can go rationalize about it, or at least present a perspective that you might not have thought about.
Well, so that actually, I'll put this up on screen. There's the sequential thinking MCP server from Anthropic, which is for that very purpose, because we have the the LLM itself, which is like this savant, but which loses context very quickly. And so how do you kind of keep it on track? How do you have this external force that has here's your checklist, here's what you need to do, and kind of keeping it back on? You can add in the sequential thinking MCP server, where you can keep track of what step I'm on, what's the next thing to do, am I on a branch, and how do I get back? Really neat things that you think, okay, this would be part of a higher level intelligence, and right now we're figuring out how to put those pieces together.
Correct.
So sequential thinking, that's I was going to mention that later. But yeah, one of the favorite MCP servers that is very useful. And the cool thing is you can plug this into any project, add a sentence or two to the end of your rules or whatever is your project scaffolding. Like, use sequential thinking to think clearly, and it will figure out what to do with itself.
Yeah, that's a great example of one where, this as an extension, there's an MCP server. The tool knows how to create a plan, how to execute it, and the LLM just can use that to execute. So yeah, that's an excellent example of that kind of use.
Well, let's pull up one of the other Amazon articles just while we're on the topic. Let's put this on the tab. Harness the power of MCP servers with Amazon Bedrock agents. Have you seen this one?
Yes, I saw this one recently. And I think I love this one. So just fundamentally, I think where the MCP servers become most useful and most powerful is when they are run with agents. Agents as an abstraction over these MCP servers, where agents are enabled with all these tools. Like, think of agent as a persona, a human equivalent persona that exists over there to do something useful. Humans rely a ton on tools that make them more productive, that make them more efficient, that actually help them do something effectively. And agents, in a very similar manner, need tools. Earlier, the first generation of agents that we created just drove themselves with prompts and nothing else, and very little other context. But now that you have tools, you can dynamically look at what do you need and then go fetch the appropriate tools to get the job done. And I think that is a fundamental difference. So the fact that now Bedrock agents have access to all these MCP servers out there, you can now create some incredibly powerful agents that was almost impossible before.
I really like that definition of agents, because sometimes that's one of the issues right now is these definitions are kind of fluid. And so I always think of like travel agents, right, where they have a specific function, and not that they couldn't do any other things. I'm sure you could ask your travel agent to, I don't know, ask them about the weather, but that's not what they're there for. To talk about travel. Diagram, it's a little bit misleading because they have a one-to-one relationship between client and servers, and then a many-to-one between agent and clients, or one-to-many. But yeah, it's a really neat tool. They have some great examples in the GitHub of using a Cost Explorer agent. Actually, there we go. Yeah, the Cost Explorer agent, and you can build this. You can experiment with it. It's a very thorough.
I agree, and I think having that sequence diagram in there is actually incredibly useful because you can really understand the underlying operating mechanics of this. So I love the way this particular article has been described. If we were to apply our clouds and rating for this one, I would absolutely give this 4.5 clouds. And it I don't know if it simplifies, but it actually really enables developers to do a lot more compared to what they were able to do just a couple of months ago.
I agree. I think simplify. I think this is contributing to a building block that one day will simplify in aggregate.
Yes.
But this particular thing is not simpler than it not existing in the first place.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one other one that I want to show that I actually saw. Let's put this up here. This is from Danilo Paccia, who is a frequent AWS blogger. And this is his own repository. You see here, Danilo MCP to Lambda. So this is the other way where you can run any AWS Lambda function as an LLM tool without any code changes using MCP. So if you have a Lambda function sitting there, Maybe it's for image processing or translating a sentence, or, whatever you have a Lambda function for. You could stick an MCP server in front of it, and all of a sudden you've got
Correct.
MCP.
Yeah,
So
and all of the capabilities of the Lambda function are now available to the LLM. And we were kind of doing this, at a very fundamental level earlier, where we would take that Lambda function and then we'd create this JSON object and then offer it as a tool to the LLM. Now all of that is made super easy with the simple library. So, great contribution to the community.
we'll put this in the links in the end of this description. Well, cool. All right.
Perfect.
Well, I wanted to spend a moment to take this tab off, talk about what are your other favorite MCP servers that you've run into working with MCP over the last couple of weeks now.
Great. So I have probably 3 or 4 that I want to talk about. The first one is, of course, we live in the Google Workspace setup, right? At work, we've got everything from Gmail to GChat to our Google Docs, whether it be docs, spreadsheets, or even the calendar. I think the calendar is probably the one thing that kind of our entire work life revolves around. So I love the MCP servers that we currently use for all the Google Workspace related services, because it really makes life easy to have simple agents that can do things that you want it to do on your data. And so that's probably my number one most used set of MCP servers. The second one is memory from our friends at Mem0. So one of the drawbacks of everything that's currently in the LLM space is that you kind of lose context when you go across chats, when you go across sessions which span multiple days. And so we have a little MCP server wrapper around Mem0, which allows us to actually across session remember stuff, and that keeps adding to the context, and that context can then be used over a period of time, and it starts becoming very, very useful. So any insights, any tips, any relationships that we realize during one conversation can then be brought up in another conversation as well. So that I find incredibly useful. I think the third one that I would bring up in terms of tool use is GitHub and AWS services. So we have little agents and tools that allow us to write code and execute them against AWS, and also just query everything that we have in GitHub across projects. And when we have to do things like RCAs on issues that we have these tools basically go in and deep dive as much as needed to go look at CloudWatch, go look at all of your logs in there, go look at the state of the services, go look at CloudTrail if need be, go look at the source code to correlate all of this stuff and figure out what went wrong, and then create a deep RCA that would have otherwise taken humans anywhere from a day to a week to go uncover. So I love that set of GitHub and AWS MCP servers where we've got a select set of AWS services. I'll also come to the pitfalls of this, by the way. This is a good segue. So you want to very specifically pick which services you want MCP servers for, and we use those. And the last one is there are a certain set of tools that allow us to do deep searches and internet searches and so on, and browser use, which are incredibly valuable for any LLM to kind of help you do your research. And it's a combination of things like deep search perplexity, all of these MCP servers that we have, you being able to use them with your LLM to actually do the research you want to do is incredibly valuable.
I completely agree. The perplexity one has been great. Just always being able to have that in there. I have another one I made myself that just wraps a tool that's an article extractor. So it just grabs any URL in Markdown. Being able to have that is really easy. There's one other
Yeah,
one.
we have one for Firecrawl that does something similar. So Firecrawl, if you guys haven't, seen that, Firecrawl is an amazing tool that allows you to look at websites, not just scrape them, but also analyze all the content within it in a structured format. And we have an MCP server for that, which the LLMs are great at using to pull data from websites or pull data from articles and stuff that we read and we think are important.
Well, I'll tell you one that I used the other day that saved me a heap of time was the WordPress MCP server. So all of our we have different WordPress sites for various projects, and I needed to update a set of pages. And so I had a Google Sheet that had a set of pages, and I said, okay, for each one of these pages, grab the post ID, go to WordPress, update it according to this tag, look up this URL if possible, and supplement with extra information. And it just I did this using Cursor, and it worked. It was slightly scary though, in that you could type in to your MCP server, say, replace every single web page with memes, and it would have happily just gone and done it until your Cursor budget ran out. It would have happily just gone at, I guess it would stop at 25 tool calls, but yeah, it would have just gone ahead and done it. But the discoverability in the WordPress API is really cool, because you can say, here's some web pages that I forgot to tag. Go ahead and tag them all. And it will look up your tags. It will then look up each of the pages. It will know which tags to associate with what pages. It's, that was one of those, little data hygiene projects that you had to do, but it's boring and annoying. I had it in a Google Sheet, so I said with the Google Sheet API or Google Sheet MCP server, go through this Google Sheet, tag everything in WordPress, and I just kind of babysat it and watched and hit refresh, and it was fine. And occasionally it would do something a little bit silly, and I'd have to tell it to backtrack, but it was great. But actually, you do bring up a point of what are some of the pitfalls that you've run into with MCP, having used it, because it's not perfect. There's really plenty of room for improvement. So what are the pitfalls as you've seen it so far?
Yeah, I think the number one pitfall is that there's just so much hype about it and such a rush to co-create your MCP servers that I think we are also putting out a ton of garbage out there in that process. Okay. And the reason is the following. LLMs do well with MCP servers that are well-defined, that feel like a natural language extension of what the tool or the endpoint does. The definition of the tool and the endpoint is very well defined. It knows exactly when and how to use it, or that's very clearly defined in the descriptions. Now, when you kind of fail at creating that perfect definition of an MCP server, you kind of fail the LLM. Okay. Now, let me give you an example. If you look up the raw definition of, or the API definition of the Gmail's send email API call, okay, just the raw API spec, you'd be shocked. Now, let me ask you this question, Stephen. What do you think are the parameters to that call?
Well, so thinking about it as a human, you want to say to, from, subject, contents, right? Okay,
awesome.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Imagining it's about 50 different things.
It is none of these, by the way. There's no to, there's no from, there's no subject, there's no BCC, there's no CC, there is no content, there is no attachment as parameters.
Some tools just find AWS cost savings and make you do all the work. Visualizing cost opportunities is great, but that's not enough. CloudFix, on the other hand, actually delivers those savings for you. And you don't need to worry, because CloudFix uses AWS recommended savings techniques. It fixes, not just finds. It's the easiest way to save money on AWS. It's 100% automatic and risk-free. And the best part of all, it works non-stop. Stop overspending on AWS and click on the link to start saving now.
said that there were 20 different fields, none of which you had to, subject, from, attachment. None of that is in the Gmail send email parameter in the tool there. And so we're doing the MCP a disservice, or we're doing the LLM a disservice if we just kind of copy the API.
That's right. So yeah, if we just take that same API definition, and by the way, the description of how to actually use that API is also quite terrible. You can't just give that to an LLM and expect it to do well with creating an email if you have to send it out, right? So that's a terrible description of how to build out an MCP tool. MCP tools should be rethought of. You should think about it as, okay, if I want to give an LLM a simple capability to send out an email, I would create a layer on top of the Gmail API and literally say, I'll have a few fields saying to CC, BCC, subject line, and content body, and maybe attachments, right? That should be your definition of the send email tool that you then expose via MCP, because that is something that I think any LLM would be able to do a great job of identifying which tool to use when. Because one of the problems that happens is when you have a large number of tools that you then put into the that you make available to the LLM, LLMs will really struggle to pick the right tool at the right time. And then you keep scratching your head to try and figure out, why did it not pick the tool when I've actually given it the tool? Right? And it's because it doesn't know when to use the right tool, because the descriptions are just so obfuscated and the parameters are so obfuscated.
Okay, you're gonna laugh at this one. This is the WordPress one that I've been using, and I think you might see this as the anti-pattern. Let's see. Oh, let me share this tab. Okay, there's two tools: discover endpoints and call endpoint. And this wraps the entire WordPress REST API. Now, it is, this is an anti-pattern, but I think
100%.
In this case, WordPress is so well known that it's working out. But
I think it's because the WordPress API is well known to the LLM, and the LLM is trained on the underlying API, that it's actually able to construct it and do it. But I think in this case, you're just lucky. You're just absolutely lucky that it understands it.
Yeah, I've had to kind of give it some advice to kind of pin it down a little bit more. But yeah, there's two. I'm trying to understand why it's cropping in this funny way. Let's try it this way. There we go. Yeah, WP discover endpoints and WP call endpoint. And this is not the way to do it. You want something like new post, edit post,
exactly,
tag post, things that represent actions that you want to do.
100%. Yes.
But that being said, this one works surprisingly well.
I would definitely say this is just lucky because WordPress has been around for so long and the API is so well documented. You probably have, 20% of the websites on the planet that are being hosted on WordPress as well. So we just got lucky with this one. Yeah. But any other service, I think this would be a terrible way to do it.
Yeah, agreed.
And I do already see a lot of people doing something like this. And I think that's doing disservice to the MCP community out there, because it's just a whole lot of garbage that people are pushing out in the name of getting an MCP server out there very quickly. Most servers that we're looking at right now are not well thought out, unfortunately.
And then I'll have to add one is that even when you get all of this to work, it can still be slow. It often is just really slow. I have this thing I'm trying to do with MCP using the Claude desktop client. And I want to say, read a Google spreadsheet, look up some of the URLs. So basically when I was cleaning up all my tabs, I put it into a sheet and just wrote down some random notes for some of the URLs. And I wanted to read the page, read my notes, and then update my to-do list with my action items in a much more thought out way. It takes maybe a minute per row sometimes.
Yeah. Correct. And I think that's where, like I was saying earlier, you should think about MCP being great for agents And when you think about an agent, you should think about, okay, I've given it a job to do. It'll do the job and report back to me whenever it is done.
Yeah.
Net, it is orders of magnitude faster than anything that you would do yourself. But it's a terrible user experience to sit in front of the agent and just watch them do what they do. Right? It's like if you were sitting over a travel agent's shoulder and watching the monitor, the way they were using this and trying to plan out a massive itinerary, right? You'd spend probably half an hour to an hour just watching them type in a whole lot of things, look at options, ask you, a few questions maybe, but it's not worth your time to look over their shoulder. I mean, the point of having an agent is that you say, I want this done, just get it done.
Well, that brings up my last kind of contention, and I think it's not really a contention so much as a room for improvement, is that the tooling can be so much better. Like right now, like I use Cursor a lot just to drive, even if I'm not doing development, but I just want to talk to a couple of MCP servers at once. I find that Cursor is really good. On desktop, I find that it's very clunky. But all of these things, they could be so much better. I'm envisioning this tool where you could do something 2 or 3 times and say, okay, run it on this list in parallel. And right now that doesn't exist.
Correct. So I think you're specifically talking about clients over here. So the MCP client side of things is, I think, the Wild West right now. The specifications have a ton of capabilities that are defined. However, I don't think there's a single MCP client today that actually conforms to the entire definition of what the MCP client should be capable of doing. It's almost like the browser HTML spec compatibility problem. You have tons of clients out there, but not all of them satisfy all the requirements of the specification of the protocol. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have right now. Until that is resolved, like simple things like Cursor and C-Line and a few others, they have these timeouts. Like they will give only 10 seconds or 15 seconds for a response to come back from a tool. You can't run a long running job on a tool and wait for a minute, for example, to get back a response. So there are situations like that are going to cause you a lot of pain because different clients behave differently.
And then there's also supposed to be resources. MCP is supposed to support resources. So if you're talking about people, you should be able to do something like people://person ID.
Yeah.
But
that's a combination of both client and the server side. Like if the server doesn't offer resources because you just slapped on an API and then just wrapped it in a simple function call, and you don't explicitly provide access to resources as part of your MCP server definition, then it's just not available, and expecting that to be available is, I think, just not going to work.
Yes, you'll probably get a get person tool which wraps the get person endpoint.
Correct.
But it could have been a resource. But
technically, it could have been a resource.
It could have been a resource, but the client might not do it right, and the server might not do it right.
Correct.
You're supposed to also have progress. For long-running jobs, but that's not implemented anywhere.
Correct. Yeah. So, and then, by the way, there's a new spec for MCP that was recently finalized, and that's definitely very exciting. But it's probably going to take another 6 months to get implemented as part of the standard, protocol, as well as find its way into some of the clients that are out there.
Well, it is definitely a very fast-moving world. I think it's bringing back this really neat level of fun and hackerishness to programming, but at this very different level, where rather than figuring out the nuts and bolts of a particular algorithm, we're really figuring out how do we tame this force into a useful tool. I go on the Cursor forums. And there's a couple different people who are working on different workflows of how to pin down the LLMs to accomplish programming tasks. Right? There's one that I was playing with where they have one markdown file for short-term memory and another for long-term memory, and certain rules of when certain rules of like the stages of each step that need to go through, and how to use the short-term memory to keep track of where you are in the process, and cursor rules files that can help nudge things in the right direction. So it's really exciting to see all of the development in this world, and to see just people playing with different techniques in order to get this to work.
Yeah. I think I actually have a very specific point of view on this, which is over the last 50, 60 years, we built a lot of software that is meant to have humans as a consumer. And now you're seeing this big rush for software, which is going to have LLMs as its consumers. This is software that's built for LLMs. It's meant for LLMs to consume. I also foresee, for example, that every website needs to have, a version of it which is meant for LLMs to read, not for humans to read, right? Like today, when we look at a lot of our websites and the way they're structured, it feels like it's such a terrible scenario for an LLM to want to read it, because it's unstructured in ways that I can't even begin to describe. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who was working on something that was, he was trying to import Word documents to do analysis on the data within them. And he was like, a 2.3 megabyte, I'm just reading out the text over here. It says a 2.3 megabyte Word document. If you were to just take all the content and put it in Markdown in a structured format, it is 20 KB. I was like, it is so much more efficient for the LLM to just take Markdown, which is structured. It conveys exactly the same amount of information. But because, for whatever reason, humans consume the Word document better, it is in a Word document format, right? So I think we're going to see a huge wave of software that's going to be very specific to how LLMs need to consume data and consume content, rather than humans being the primary target.
You're talking about Microsoft Word. I saw this great YouTube short today where this person was saying, if the physical world behaved like Microsoft Word, and they push their coffee table an inch, and all of a sudden their lamp is on the ceiling, and this is exactly what, because of all this extra stuff in there that you don't need. And we're starting to see standards like LLMs.txt that should sit next to robots.txt and your sitemap. And I think the new SEO is optimizing to LLMs, not optimizing to people.
That is absolutely right. And you'll see a lot of this. You'll see a lot of software being created with LLM as their primary consumers, not humans. So exciting times for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wanted to wrap this one up. Wanted to talk about MCP Hive. Now, can you introduce MCP Hive? What is it? Who's making it, and what problem is it trying to solve?
Great. So we already discussed a bunch of problems that have existed with MCPs, right? I mean, there's a bunch of non-standardization already. And as an organization, as we were trying to figure out how do we make it easy to take some of our API and make it available as MCP servers, we were thinking about all the problems. The other issue was that when MCP protocol first came out, there was only the concept of local. There was no concept of remote. Like you couldn't host something for somebody. Everything had to be running locally on your machine and so on. So there were a bunch of decisions that we made which sat on top of the MCP protocol that solved a lot of the gaps that exist currently. Authentication is one such gap. Not having access to remote is the second gap. Not having a place to host in a standard way is another gap as well. So MCP Hive is a platform which basically allows you to create your MCP servers, host them as hives, and future looking tries to solve a very fundamental problem, which we believe is that till LLMs get infinite context, and they're getting there, but it's probably going to be a little bit away, and get really good at not having a needle in the haystack problem, which is when you have tons and tons of context. Let's say you have 10 million tokens of context sitting inside your prompt. If the LLM is incapable of sifting through all of that in one shot and not missing out data, you're always going to have a problem that if you give the LLM 100 tools, it's going to mess up. it's going to start giving you garbage as the output because it won't know which tool to use at what time. It's like, and if you give an apprentice 100 applications to use and tell them go do this job, they just don't know how to navigate it all because they haven't used 100 apps before. They don't know which app is best for what and how best to use it. So you have a similar situation with LLM. You should treat an LLM like an untrained assistant that is fresh on the job and you're just giving it all the tools. So it makes sense to be more focused. So we have the idea of creating what we call a dynamic hive, which is a dynamic set of MCP servers or tools where you can say, I want this tool, that tool, this tool, put it together and make that available to the LLM during a prompt. And you can do that very dynamically. And that's a huge advantage because you don't need all tools at all times. If you could figure out exactly what tools are relevant for a particular job, then you can basically make that available. And lastly, MCP Hive does a lot of quality checking on descriptions, parameters, and stuff that feel like garbage. So you can actually use MCP Hive to look through all of your different services. It allows you to simplify the descriptions. It allows you to simplify the definitions, and also allows you to build a higher order definition of the service, like the Gmail example that I was giving you earlier, and make it simpler for someone to actually use MCP or make the LLM or give an LLM a better set of definitions and tools so that they can be more effective. So you can check out MCP Hive at mcp-hive.ti.trilogy.com. It's available, it's public, and there are some interesting use cases that you might love to check out.
There it is. Yeah, I've been using it quite a bit. What I find really helpful is being able to take subsets of the tools, like you said, especially for the Google ones. I've been using Google Sheets, and if you just carte blanche import everything there is to do with Google Sheets, that's like 20 tools, and you don't need that many tools for Google Sheets. I want, append and get details, and that's probably enough. And so why pollute your context and confuse the LLM when you could say, okay, for this one, I want perplexity search, 2 parts of Google Sheets, and WordPress, and sequential thinking.
Yeah.
And that would be great. And then for another project, you might have another combination. I find that when I use something like Cursor or Claude Desktop, I am constantly commenting things in and out of my MCP config file. And I've got a couple ones that I move around. Okay. But if you have multiple cursor windows to open, that's going to be a problem.
True.
So being able to have a hive that says, this is all the tools that I want, that's pretty neat. And have it be a curated list that's specific to a particular project.
That's right. And the nice thing about MCP Hive is that it takes care of everything from authentication, which is personal to you. So one of the issues with MCP right now, and of course this is being fixed in the next version, with a similar implementation to what we've already got in place in MCP Hive, you can, when you create a connection to a remote server, that connection is specific to you. So you put in your authorization details, whether it's OAuth or API key or bearer token or any of those mechanisms. Those are specific credentials that you have put in for your sessions. So when you get a connection string that's specifically for you, and MCP Hive runs a local proxy, which basically allows you to connect. So instead of having everything local where you have to pull down a Docker container, you have to run the Docker container yourself locally for the client to connect to. You now have a mechanism by which the local proxy will redirect you to the remote server where things are hosted and run specifically for you. And your connection string is specific to your session with your authorization credentials. So it makes it secure, it makes it safe, and it allows you to have access to data that you would not otherwise have been able to provide to the LLM.
Yeah, when I was using Google Sheets via MCP Hive, I just said, okay, I want to use this. It came up with the very familiar, this app wants to have access. Here's the scopes it wants. I hit OK, and then I get a URL that, there we go. It's baked into it. I can access it over SSE, or I can use the local proxy, and that's right. I don't have to deal with Google authentication, which is it's a lot. It's heavy. So
Yes,
not
it is
everything-
definitely. OAuth in general is heavy because it's just the protocol and the way it has to work. And MCP Hive simplifies that for any application that needs OAuth, OAuth authorization.
And so this is available for the general public right now?
Yes, it is available to the general public. Go check it out. It's mcp-hive.ti.trilogy.com.
Awesome. We will have links to that in the video description. Okay, well, I think we have to wrap up this episode. So go out there, play with MCP, play with Bedrock, play with
Yeah,
AI.
and if you have any questions for us, please reach out to us. We would love to answer your questions and get feedback on both MCP Hive and any questions on MCP in general. And yeah, we'd love to see what you create on the AWS platform as well.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, until next time, we will see you later. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.